Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen on air or online at iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn app, smart speakers, nccradio.org, or on our own WHPC app. Download it. And podcasts of the show are also available wherever you get podcasts. So we can see you there, we can see you here, and thank you so much for joining us. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we're so happy to bring on board our guest, Dr. Randall Bell, who is a sociologist and economist who specializes in disaster recovery projects. Dr. Bell has consulted in many tragedies around the world, including the World Trade Center, Flight 93, Sandy Hook, BP oil spill, and Hurricane Katrina, among many others. On today's show, we will discuss his book, Post-Traumatic Thriving. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Bell.
Oh, Ellen, it's a privilege to be with you. Thank you.
Now, I am looking at your new book. It looks like it's actually coming out in 2023. So we're right up to the publishing date here. So let's go back in time. And, it's an interesting focus that you have about trauma. What led you to specialize in that?
Well, I started my career as an economist crunching numbers, and apparently I got pretty good at it because the cases that I was getting got bigger and bigger until they became the biggest. And I enjoy that part of my career, but over the decades, I started enjoying even more getting to know the people I was meeting behind the statistics. And oftentimes we would become acquainted or even friends, and we would have a friendship or a relationship for years after the disaster. And I noticed that some people, the disaster really kind of hammered them. They had trouble getting back on their feet, but others bounced back, and they actually did better than they ever were before the trauma, whatever it was. And I kept my eye on these folks and really was intrigued to the point where I spent years researching what I call post-traumatic thriving and really tapping into the fuel of the trauma and bouncing back.
So I love that. That's turning something like we often hear about post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's something that's discussed a lot in the news. But you're actually saying, okay, things happen. And actually, a lot of things like that might be considered traumatic happen to almost everyone to some degree or other, some more than others. People, for instance, who have a hurricane come by and their whole house is gone, or a tornado, that not everybody, goes through. But we do usually have some trauma in our life. Have you found that the degree of trauma relates to how badly it affects someone, or is there something within people that allows them to be resilient?
Well, that's an interesting question because, one thing that can happen to somebody, and they just kind of shrug it off, and somebody else is really very devastating. By college age, 66 to 85% of folks have experienced at least one trauma, whether it be the loss of a loved one or a car wreck or, pick from that long list of things that can happen. I think that it's very individualized, but there's a common denominator in terms of the cycle that people go through, whatever that trauma looks like. And I've really kind of focused on that particular cycle, which I call dive, survive, and thrive. Dive is where you get knocked down. Survive is where you get back on your feet. And thrive is where you take off. Everybody kind of has the potential for going through those three specific cycles.
And also you talk about, the phases. I know that I definitely am one of those people who, no matter what happens, I don't get ruffled. Really, it's just amazing. People have me with them at a particular thing. There's a car accident or really someone dies or, big things, and everyone else is just sort of crying, carrying on. And I'm just like, okay, well, that means we have to, do whatever's next that we have to do to take care of it. And they're always saying, how are you like that? And I never try to be like that. I just think that I have this actually attitude towards life in general, where I don't do emotional highs and lows. And, I guess now that I'm older, I've learned that that's something that would be called a Zen attitude, but really I was born that way.
Yeah, well, that's the DNA, and you're very fortunate to have that. Half of happiness is dependent on DNA, and it sounds like you were dealt a good hand in that regard.
Well, then again, I would say not necessarily, because I don't experience a really thrilled about anything either. It's just all okay, whatever, good. It's just all it's just walking down this middle path. But I do notice many people have, shock and anger and depression after things happen. I would say that's normal. And what your wonderful book talks about is that you can proceed through these things. And would you say there's specific steps that you can take so that you're going to be thriving at the end?
Oh, absolutely. And there's certain very simple techniques you can start applying in life to really move through things a little more smoothly. So that's what the book is all about, is research into what works, what doesn't work, different attitudes, different practices. That's what it's all about, is some modification to get through life's knockdowns. And
you yourself, of course, as an individual, have experienced trauma. Would you like to share any of those incidences with our audience?
Well, sure. It's I don't know, in a way, it's kind of funny. I wrote the book initially, and I had the manuscript all done, and it was and I'm embarrassed to say it, but it's true. I was very kind of professorial. You need to do this, you need to do that, and kind of telling people what to do based upon all the research. And at the same time, I was getting ready to go hike Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa with some buddies. And I was meeting with my doctors to kind of get checked up and ready to go. Long story short, one of the doctors said, get to a cardiologist right away. And I did. And he told me I needed heart surgery. And I thought, I need a second opinion. And I went to a second cardiologist, and she told me, well, I think I can keep you out of the operating room. And what this did is it triggered me, because when I was 11 years old, I had open heart surgery, and that was traumatic. And I had never really processed it successfully. I made the classic mistake that a lot of people make, and that is I stuffed the discussion. I didn't want to talk about it. I never did talk about it. If it was brought up by somebody else, I quickly changed this topic. And that's how I handled that childhood trauma. Well, as a result, I was standing on her treadmill doing a test, and my heart rate before she even turned on the machine was 150. And those are classic responses of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was, I just ate a big serving of humble pie, because I realized I was traumatized, maybe even subconsciously. I was writing this book and doing this research because I hadn't really dealt with my own internal trauma. And so, long story short, I had to rewrite the whole manuscript and say, we could do this, or I tried this and it worked. And I had to bring myself into the reality that it affects me like everyone else.
Yes, and I have to say that for sure, when I reached out to your publicist to actually schedule this radio show, she said, we're going to have to put it off because you're hiking Mount Kilimanjaro. So, this is like a real story. But how was that experience?
Well, it's a great experience because this stuff really works. My cardiologist, she's very holistic. I got rid of the old guy and really focused on my attention on her advice. But she teaches a meditation class at night, which I took. And also the other dynamic dual that I introduced in the first chapter of the book is meditation, which is not a religious practice. It's just deep breathing exercises, which rewires the amygdala at the base of the brain. And there's Harvard studies that show that. And the second thing is talking about it. I now freely talk about my childhood trauma, but I don't get triggered. I don't get elevated or emotional. The memory passes right through my mind harmlessly. And that's the ultimate goal, not to forget about trauma, not to bury it, but to actually talk about it when it comes up and have it harmlessly pass through your brain without being re-triggered. And so with this holistic approach, I summited Mount Kilimanjaro, and I don't think I would have made it. In fact, I would have been in the operating room had I not learned these techniques and the other things in the book.
Well, I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. You can listen live online at nccradio.org or iHeartRadio. For more information on today's guest or topic, send us an email at whpc@ncc.edu. And today we are talking to Dr. Randall Bell, PhD, and we're talking about his new book, Post-Traumatic Thriving. But Dr. Bell, you have an amazing array of things that are traumatic events that you were involved with or, are a consultant for, such as the World Trade Center and Sandy Hook. What's your feedback on being at those places?
Well, that brings up an issue of kind of secondhand trauma, because I obviously wasn't in New York when the World Trade Center happened, but by total sheer coincidence, the 9/11 happened on a Tuesday, and I was scheduled to be in New York the following Monday to give a speech. And I called the executive director of the association I was speaking at, and she said, believe it or not, we would like you to still come out. I just assumed the event had been canceled. And I went out there, and it was very somber. And then after, I took the subway down to Ground Zero, and I was literally shocked at what I saw. It was just so horrible, walking the streets of New York and having people come up to me with flyers saying, "Hey, have you seen my mom?" or "Have you seen my dad?" And literally that happened. And there were flyers all over of people looking for their loved ones. And little did I know that later I would be retained to actually compute the economic damages and the situation of Ground Zero. And so I saw it both, in the raw aftermath and then also working through it. And, it's one of these events that just shook any reasonable person's psyche up pretty good. And it really kind of brought up the fact that when we just simply watch TV or listen to the radio for listening to the news, we can be traumatized by what people are going through, because there's so much stuff going on around the world. And with communication today, we can learn about it or hear about it in our cars or our living rooms. So we got to kind of manage the stress that's constantly being piped into our worlds. The problem is, Ellen, that it's not taught in school. These survival skills and these thriving skills are not taught in school. And that's what this book is all about, is to give people tools and resources, that started at cases like the World Trade Center and others, so that we can kind of navigate through life a little more successfully.
I think that's such a great topic for people to, like you said, I think the trauma could be big or it can be just small, something that happened interpersonally. And like you talked about meditation, that's why I love the word mindfulness, which is a more recent word for kind of the same thing. But it takes out what I have heard pushback about in terms of meditation being Eastern mystical religious, which might go against someone else's religion. But when we take the real concepts of it, there is nothing like that that's interfering.
Yeah. The first time I ever meditated, and I can't make this up, I was volunteering at San Quentin Prison in California. That's where California's death row is. It's a very serious place. And I was in a circle in a group discussion, literally sitting between two convicted murderers, holding hands. And they don't call it meditation. They call it grounding. They like that word better because meditation can bring up notions, good or bad, and depending on people's perspectives. So we call it grounding, but it's the same thing. It's simply the deep breathing, or mindfulness is another great word. But it's one of the most powerful things you can do to reset the brain and calm it down. I can actually, or anybody can actually watch our blood pressure drop dramatically with just a few minutes of this. So it's really the starting point of healing from trauma.
What's the best place for people to find out more? Could they just look you up somewhere? Do you have a website?
Yeah, I actually have a podcast with, remember the whole O.J. Simpson case? I became friends with the Brown family, and I have a podcast, Post-Traumatic Thriving, which I host with Tanya Brown, Nicole's sister. And so we have guests in. In fact, we have a guest coming in this morning, and we do kind of a long format. We go sometimes for hours, and we break them into segments. But we talk through people's traumas, what their life was like before the trauma, what happened, and then their recovery, and then what they're doing today, which is oftentimes very phenomenal. We have people that have been movie stars and sports agents. The real Jerry Maguire came on. We had the Buttafuoco family come on with the aftermath of their ridiculous father's behavior.
All the Long Island listeners probably remember that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have interesting guests. And so if people are working through trauma, they find it really helpful to just listen to the podcast and realize, A, I'm not alone, and B, okay, here's some stuff I got to do to kind of navigate through this successfully. And that would be a free resource for anybody. Of course, there's the book, but that's kind of the mission I'm on, is to kind of help educate, whoever's interested on these issues of trauma recovery, because the resources are there and the tools are there. So
both the book and the podcast has the same name, which is your topic, Post-Traumatic Thriving. So that's a good way to find you. Now, you have a lot of great things in the book of specific steps to take. So what do you mean by trauma triage?
Well, trauma triage is this concept that there's the trauma, and then there's the you can become a victim, you can become a survivor, or you can deal things in a healthy way. And the graphic I don't have in front of me, but basically it's this concept that there's different avenues you can take in the aftermath of a trauma. You don't want to become a victim. You don't want to become an enabler. You want to handle it in a more positive way.
And also recognizing, I know your topic is not about grief, but I know that they talk about grief. Also, even though you think you alone are experiencing these things after a loved one is lost, it's actually something that's known about specific stages. And it's really wonderful to be able to step back and watch yourself move through them. And I know in your book, you talk about shock, denial, and anger.
Yeah, what I did that I think is a little innovative is that there's the Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief, and those are actually at the start of the book. And then there's a bunch of literature that came out from some professors on the East Coast called post-traumatic growth, and those are the last 5 chapters of the book. And then I kind of did a bridge from grief from the grief to a bridge of survival, and then getting into the literature on post-traumatic growth. So it starts with the chapter of shock and then goes through the grief, which is well established in the psychology world, and then ends up getting into the thriving stages. So you kind of start at the low, the initial, shock of the whole event, and then graduate, there's 15 chapters. And at the end, you're basically then in those more advanced stages. So it's a nice kind of progression of how things really look when we're dealing with trauma.
Right. And sort of what actions to take. But a lot of these actions are internal actions in terms of mindset.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I was pretty thorough in laying out all the different options. It's kind of like a buffet. You pick, the things that work for you, and you pass on the things that don't work for you. But having the buffet presented before you can be very, very helpful, because then what to, really what's going to work with you, and then you select those things.
So it's good to hear about, like, let's say, trauma survivors, so that that there are others who went through, horrendous lifetime events, but now they're, back to living a happy life.
Oh, absolutely. And this, at the end of each chapter, we follow the stories of several people. One of them is Jerry Jewell. I went to high school with Jerry. You might recognize her name because she was the first disabled person in history to land a network television role. And Norman Lear discovered her in a comedy club, and then she was cast on Facts of Life, and then she just starred in Deadwood. I was just in Norman Lear's house with Jerry just last week, and here she is in high school. She's a disabled person. She has crutches, and yet Jerry was phenomenal because she always had a crowd around her because she was so funny and so witty and so inviting and so inclusive. And she was very disarming because you quickly forgot about her disability because, and you saw through that superficial thing and saw what a wonderful person she was. And then it was no surprise to see her kind of rise to the top. She spoke at the White House 3 times. We've had her on the podcast. But it's stories of real people that in each case, I actually know these people or I know their spouses. And we follow their journey. Leo Fender invented the electric guitar. People don't know it, but he was blind in one eye. He was deaf. And yet it's today, Fender guitar is $1 billion a year industry. So and he, by the way, he lived 2 blocks from me growing up in Fullerton, California. So these are real people with real traumas that have done remarkable things with their life. And so that's, to me, it's very inspirational.
That's true. And those, of course, are people who, sort of made it to the top and that they have name recognition, but not everybody, of course, gets there, but almost everybody has some trauma in their life as well.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, Leo Fender was the last person that wanted name recognition. And some people don't want it at all. I mean, I through Jerry, I met some stars in Hollywood, and the name recognition become obnoxious and kind of get in the way. For regular folks, more like, for regular folks, success or whatever you want to call it comes in different ways. And fame and building huge companies isn't always in everybody's kind of crosshairs. We kind of pick what works for us, but whatever that looks like, the steps in the book will help us get there.
So I love in the book that you make things very understandable. For instance, the acronym SODA, SODA, which stands for serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, and adrenaline. Why are those important to understand as you're going through trauma?
Well, I learned when we were dealing with the inmates in San Quentin, their crimes traumatize others. And there's no doubt about that. They also traumatize their own families. And of course, they're traumatized by being in prison. So there's a big dose of trauma going all the way around. And we discovered that as we explained the physiology to the inmates in terms of being triggered and the reactions of shock and what we do in terms of nature's instincts to fight with the flight, fight, freeze response when we go into shock, it helps calm people down so that they realize, hey, this flash of emotion I'm feeling is normal. It's nature's way of protecting me and getting me to a safe place. But I need to be aware of that and not react impulsively and instead react deliberately through these episodes of being triggered. And we've seen inmates who came into prison because of horrible crimes. You name it on the list. I've pretty much seen it all. But through a couple years of these steps, and a lot of times, whether people like it or not, they're going to be paroled. And the question is, do you want them paroled as a reoffender or paroled as truly rehabilitated to the point where they are gentlemen, they are in control of their emotions, and you would be quite happy them living down the street because they're never going to reoffend. They have no desire to ever go back to prison. That's kind of the goal. And in teaching the physiology, as your question brings up, really helps them understand what mistakes they made, why they made them, and at least deal with emotions that comes along with life more effectively going forward.
It's great for people to learn about that. Like even, oxytocin is called the cuddle hormone. And when we can support its creation in the body, which we actually can do, it makes you feel just much more relaxed. So there's so many great tips in your book for people to understand and also listen to the podcast, Post-Traumatic Thriving. What is CoreIQ.com? Because that's what they gave for your contact.
Oh, CoreIQ is CoreIQ is the nonprofit that publishes the book and publishes the podcast. If you go to CoreIQ.com, there's all kinds of free resources and videos across the board, everything from time management, goal setting skills. They're basically life skills, again, that we all need that aren't taught in school. That's what CoreIQ's mission is.
Well, I will tell you that if those who are listening, it's CoreIQ.com, but do not try to write that down if you're listening in your car. We have a lot of car listeners, Dr. Bell. But once you can visit our archives, you can always visit our archives at WHPC, and we'll have that as a live link that people can go right to, as well as to your podcast, Post-Traumatic Thriving, if people would like to learn more. So I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. What is one, sort of ending comment that you'd love to share with our listeners?
Well, we're all in this together, this thing called life. And hopefully most our days are good and things are productive, but all kinds of things can hit us, whether it be depression or the loss of a loved one. Just last week, my wife lost her dog, which for her has been very devastating. So these hits come along. We've got to recognize that we don't learn these coping skills in school. So we've got to kind of take responsibility. We may not be responsible for our trauma, but we're always responsible for our healing. And so reading the books, listening to the podcasts, doing things that proactively, bring into our lives a healthy skill set is, I think, the best way to kind of manage things when we have those unfortunate things come our way.
It's a great idea, and maybe have it available because someone in your life who has been through trauma, if it's not you, because that's just life. It's full of all kinds of unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable events. So thank you so much for being our guest today.
Well, thank you, Ellen. It's been really a pleasure speaking with you.
And listeners, thank you for tuning in once again to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.